Well, thank you everybody for joining us. I want to honor your time. I know it's probably lunch hour for some of you, so we want to respect that and get through that time. Really important topic, really personal topic, not just for me, but for I think a lot of people in general, but certainly a lot of healthcare people, a lot of nurses, a lot of people, teachers. I think is another big one that this really impacts. But burnout, I think, has been a conversation for a long time, but certainly over the past few years has been something that's increased quite a bit. Chrissy and I've talked about it a little bit. Melissa and I've talked about it, and Aaron actually, who's on the call today too, has studied this a lot. Actually, has a lot of expertise in this area. So I'm going to try to not be nervous that she knows more about this than I do as as I present, but may invite her into the conversation a couple of times as we go through too. So right now, I think everybody that we've got on are friends that I know. So that's actually kind of fantastic. Really glad to have you all. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of an idea of where we're headed today. And there we go. This will be an outline of today's session. So we're going to start with definitions. What is moral distress? What is burnout? We'll circle back to those a couple of times to make sure we're clear on that. At the very least, I want you to walk away with sort of an understanding of what those two things are. We'll talk through some studies and stats. What does the landscape of burnout look like right now? Give some examples, so not just definitions, but a couple examples of that. I'm going to tell you a little bit of my personal burnout story. Some of you know pieces and parts. You're going to get a little bit of not a comprehensive story about Patrick's burnout, but a nutshell version of that today. And then we're going to go into some practical things, the organizational path, 7 steps organizations, department leaders, coworkers can take to help avoid or alleviate burnout. We're going to talk about what happens if we don't address burnout. What happens if we don't address moral distress, moral injury, the burnout and the stress that so many of our coworkers are facing. And then we're going to go into what I think is maybe my unique contribution here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about things that I've done over the past 9 months that have helped me. There's not as much research that I've found, at least. It's not as readily accessible. What do you do as an individual to help yourself once you're burned out? There's lots of great studies about organizations, about what leaders can do, about statistics of where burnout's at, not as much for that one individual. So we're going to talk through those things a little bit. I'll ask you for a quick review to kind of give me some feedback. This is a new thing for me, so I'll appreciate having your feedback on it, and then we'll end with some encouragement. So it won't be super encouraging until number 9. So just as a warning, we're talking about the level of burnout and what people are experiencing. Won't be super encouraging, but we will end with some encouragement to make sure we don't end on that sort of hard note there. So just a little bit of a preview. As we talk about overcoming burnout, this is a personal topic for me. So this image that you see here is me in our own emergency department. And I'll kind of get into that story as I talk through my personal burnout story. So some simple definitions. Let's jump right into it. Moral distress occurs when you witness or take an action that violates your personal values. So I really want to kind of slow down there and get a hold of this. When I'm doing something that I feel is in contradiction to what I value, what my moral set is, what my ethics, maybe my cultural or religious beliefs, when I'm taking that action that violates those, or I'm having to watch that get violated on a regular basis, I can experience moral distress. And so then when that moral distress, transgressing my personal values, becomes really profound, or it just goes on for a long time, or it's just really sudden and hits me hard, then we get into what we would consider moral injury. Just a little bit of a graphic here, a pretty simple way to think about how these overlap. This is from Amanda Rosen and a group that had studied the continuum of effects here. So we have to start with moral awareness. So you may have had a coworker at some point in time that didn't have a lot of moral awareness, didn't really think about these things in terms of right or wrong. It was just what they were being told to do. And so they didn't have that moral awareness. They're not going to experience moral distress because they don't have that deep sense. And the the sense of moral awareness that we have, and the more at risk we are for moral distress. So then moral distress is something that, to be honest, most people with moral awareness, especially in the healthcare field, you're going to experience moral distress. You're not necessarily going to have lots of bad symptoms of moral distress automatically, but you're certainly going to probably have some level of moral distress. When you start to experience symptoms, of course, is in the next two phases of moral injury, where it's really hurt you deeply, personally, something that's hard to get over, keeps playing over in your mind, and then that can move into burnout. So it's not a linear line quite as much as it suggests here, but it gives you an idea of the overlap for sure. All right, we're going to get into burnout now. 3 traits of burnout. I find that some people just hearing the phrase emotional exhaustion, it's almost like a yes, that's what I've felt. That's what I feel at work right now. This emotional exhaustion, this exhaustion that even when I take a nap, even when I have a good night's sleep, that doesn't really go away. Taking a vacation doesn't alleviate all of those feelings of being tired and being exhausted. Um, taking that time off is important, but it's not really solving those issues. Sorry, I'm making sure I didn't forget to admit someone to the meeting. Give me just a second here. I'm not trying to end the meeting. No, for sure. Not trying to do that. Bear with me just a second here. Okay, no, we're good. Good. Okay, so let's continue here. I just want to make sure I wasn't ignoring anybody that was trying to be admitted. Um, So emotional exhaustion. Second trait of burnout: depersonalization or cynicism. Now I know for some of us, sarcasm is a gift. That's like a something we were born with, something we're always going to have. We're always going to be sarcastic. I want to draw a real distinct line between sarcasm and cynicism, because you might see cynicism and think, well, I'm really sarcastic. That means that I'm automatically for sure there it pops up. Okay, good. At least I know now it pops up before someone tries to log in. But cynicism and sarcasm really are two different things. So cynicism is something that lives deep inside of you, where you really feel like things are not going to get better. You're just waiting for the next shoe to drop all the time. You go into every meeting expecting something to be announced that's detrimental, that's harmful, that's hurtful. Every patient that you take care of, every person you interact with, you have the expectation that things are really going to go poorly. So, and then that depersonalization is you have to kind of decouple your personal feelings and your engagement level from what you're doing. So you can continue being sarcastic, but the cynicism is something that lives a little bit deeper, where you feel like you can't quite get to a different point. And then last but not least, the traits of burnout: just not feeling like I'm doing what I want to do at work, not feeling like I can make the difference I want to make. Like maybe I got into this field or this career, this job, because I was convinced I was going to help people in this way or that way. I was going to change the world and somehow, and now I don't have that sense that I'm able to really move that needle anymore. And so it's sort of a sense of hopelessness or even worthlessness personally, when I feel like I can't make the difference at work that I want to be able to make. So burnout, this is a way that I think about it. When being engaged with your work is a memory, not something that you feel right now. So maybe you think back to early in your career, or earlier in this job, or before the pandemic, or whatever your before was, and you remember being really engaged and really caring deeply, but you don't so much anymore when you've run out of cares to give, and you just feel like you can't care anymore. So some examples of feelings you might have when you're burned out: just trapped, I'm stuck, I can't do anything. That, like we said, hopeless, worthless. Overly sarcastic, where that's all that comes out of you. Numb, like you don't feel anything at all, or certainly just like you're going through the motions. So I want to pause there for an invite to engage in the chat. If you feel like you have personally experienced one of these, at least moral distress, where there's a violation of your values that you're either participating in or you're watching happen, or moral injury where it gets a little deeper and profound into your soul, or burnout where you're sort of trapped in this loop here? Would you just put a yes in the chat? I'd love to also see if you haven't, man, let's see your no. I haven't experienced that. That would be great to see that you have or you haven't. But let us know if you have experienced at least one of these three. Christy gives, I think that's 6 yeses for 3 topics. So that's not a good sign, Christy. Yeah, and then we're gonna go obviously through some statistics here. Yeah, for sure. Melissa and I got to visit about that a little while back. So let's consider studies. We'll find some affirmation of those feelings here. Between 18 to 25% of healthcare coworkers have quit their jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of people not just quitting that job in that place, but quitting the industry. I'm not going to be a nurse anymore. I'm not going to be a doctor anymore. I'm not going to be a medical healthcare leader anymore. I'm not going to be an allied health professional anymore. I'm going to do something completely different. And that's really a significant change in the industry. Another study, international study, where we see almost half of Australian nurses having a high emotional exhaustion level. 2/3 of American nurses, high levels of burnout. About 2/3 of Canadian nurses experiencing high emotional exhaustion. So whatever the study is, it shows just a really high level, particularly for nurses, but certainly for all healthcare providers and healthcare coworkers. In an article from the Atlantic, they talked about between 35 and 54% of American nurses and physicians were already burned out before the pandemic started. So if you're already in that place where you feel like I'm not engaged with my work anymore, I don't feel like I'm making the difference I want to make, I'm deeply cynical about how things are going, and then a worldwide pandemic gets laid on top of it, you can imagine where some of those coworkers are now. So this is not my burnout story. This is just a little example of moral distress to kind of bring it to life other than just the definitions. Do you remember, I know you do, this is a silly rhetorical question. Do you remember the beginning of the pandemic when our hospitals went to a 0 visitor policy? And I'll be honest, even when I remember that, when I start to talk about it, it gives me not positive flashbacks, I guess is the way to describe that. Well, I was one of the leaders of our healthcare system that said, I think we need to go to this 0 visitor policy. And I made that recommendation to some other more senior leaders. Then they asked me to survey our ethics committee because I lead our ethics committee. They wanted to see what the ethics committee thought about moving to, as many hospital systems already had, moving to this 0 visitor policy. We came back at that time in the early days of the pandemic with a unanimous recommendation from our ethics committee to move to this 0 visitor policy. But even after that, our senior executives weren't sort of convinced that the time was right. So there was this delay, which was new for me, to have our ethics committee make a unanimous recommendation and then to not have that adopted sort of automatically after an ethics committee had recommended that. So this experience is I would say it's a small example, but it was significant at the time. A small example of moral distress, because there's at least 3 ways that this impacted me and sort of transgressed what I valued. For one, I thought that I had a value that the ethics committee's recommendations would just sort of be followed, no matter what the case, because they had been in the past. Second of all, I felt badly about making the recommendation. It transgresses my values to say, I don't think this dying man's wife should be allowed into the hospital. That's a violation of how I normally feel, right? So I felt badly about making that recommendation, period. And then it came back to get us about a year later when the state passed a law saying we would never be permitted to make a policy like that again. So a short disconnect with our leadership and recommendations, feeling badly about it in general, and then realizing that if we try to do something similar again, it would actually be considered illegal. So there's some transgressions of my normal value system there. A second, more clinical example for our nurses pre-pandemic. We had a patient, and unfortunately for some of you as nurses, this will sound familiar, but we had a patient who was elderly, she was frail, she was in a really bad state. She had parts of her brain that were dying. She wasn't brain dead, but she had brain tissue that was dying. She had cancer just metastasized through her whole body. She really hadn't been able to talk with the team or her family for a long time. Her organs were shutting down. Of course, she was dependent upon a ventilator. She was just really in a difficult state. Now, this is unfortunately, of course, a common thing that ICU nurses are equipped to handle. But there was one significant wrinkle here, and the family required that this patient be kept on as a full code. So you can imagine what nurses felt like, what clinicians felt like, respiratory therapists, rapid response nurses, knowing that they might have to do chest compressions, push meds, bag this patient, possibly do shock for this patient if she were to code. So I'll pause and take a breath there. I'll take a sip of my coffee. I know we've got a couple nurses on. So Aaron and Chrissy, what would your feeling be in this situation? What might be some of your frustrations or thoughts?
Yeah, so this is unfortunately more common than it isn't. And it is, I'm really glad that you used it as, part of this presentation as an example of moral distress, and certainly has the potential to be morally injurious as well. I've a long time ago sort of adopted the motto or the phrase, that there are worse things than death. And as healthcare providers, this is an example of living that out. And it is one of the worst experiences to have to resuscitate someone who clearly is suffering. We are prolonging suffering by doing this, and it's tough, especially, working with adult patients, but I wouldn't limit it to adult patients. I've also worked in a children's hospital, and chronically ill children who are at the end of life is kind of another level of difficult. And yet it's the same circumstances where there are worse things than death. This child is suffering. This adult, frail, elderly patient is suffering. It just sort of doesn't matter at the end of life. And yeah, it's a really, really difficult thing to navigate. And I would argue that from a leadership standpoint, a lot is yet to be done. We have a lot of growth to do in nurturing our staff through those times, instead of just going through something and then having the expectation that we just move on and go to the next patient. There is a huge gap there from a leadership standpoint. So I could say a lot more about it, but I'm gonna let Christy jump in too.
Yeah, I see we got Kristen on too, Kristen Brennicky as well, another nurse. So other thoughts?
I guess my thought just goes to those family members, and just to say, do you understand the why behind everything? Why do you want this patient to be a full code? Why? What do you think is going to happen if we code this patient? So I guess to me, it just all goes back to, how are they right now?
Mm-hmm.
Because something isn't connecting.
Yeah,
I would.
sure.
I'm going to just agree with you, Christy, on that. And unfortunately, there are sometimes some ulterior motives that are not ethical. Families oftentimes have a financial drive to keep a family member alive, and that is an incredibly morally and ethically distressing thing to have to deal with. And then I don't know, Christy, if you've ever, back in the day, so I've been a nurse for quite a long time, and it was the norm to ask family members to leave when we would code a patient, right? We would rush everybody out of the room except the ones who were participating in the code. And I came to the point after several of these types of instances where I was like, I'm gonna need the family to watch. I'm going to need them to stay and watch, not because I'm trying to be mean, but because I need them to understand the gravity of this behavior and what the suffering looks like. Because what you said, Christy, is right. There's a disconnect there. So.
And Christian Brennick, I see you were logging back on to connect to audio there. So any thoughts before we move on? Yeah, I think you guys are obviously spot on with your thoughts about it. And I do remember sitting down with his family and trying to have a conversation. And I learned a lot through this because I tried to wear even though I was coming in as the ethics person, I tried to come in with the chaplain hat and listen and think about, like, because they were talking about wanting a miracle and God was going to intercede. And so I tried to engage on that level. And ask a question that I often ask: what does a miracle look like in this situation? Kind of to Aaron's point of there's some things that are worse than death. And I got shut down pretty quickly in this scenario. And I think they sniffed out that I was one of the people saying this wasn't an ethical thing right now, that we were maintaining this individual as a full code. And we've made some changes. I won't go into the changes because that's not kind of the point of today's talk. We've made some changes that would help us significantly in the situation now where doctors can say this is not medically appropriate, it's not ethically appropriate, and we will not do the code on your person. Now that can only happen when there's some time that goes by, right? So if that person's just come in the ED, they're rushed to surgery, they're rushed upstairs, sometimes that conversation can't happen that quickly. But we have put some of those things in place, but certainly had not put those in place at the time of this story. Good. So absolutely, the nurses and the family. This patient unfortunately did code, as was sort of predictable. And she received CPR for 47 minutes. Unfortunately, of course, these things never happen at 2:00 in the afternoon. So it was 11:30 at night, and the only person in the room was her granddaughter. And so her granddaughter's, sobbing in the corner, seeing, as Aaron pointed out, sometimes you do have to actually see what it is to fully understand what's going on. She was in the room. She wanted to be in the room with her grandma, but she's going through this agony. And so while in a lot of my talks, I would focus on the grief of the granddaughter, today we want to think about the nurses and the moral injury that they experience. Because when we think about that definition, when we're taking an action that violates our personal values, that there's no greater example than a nurse who thinks this is inappropriate to do CPR and then going through the physical labor of doing CPR in a situation where they thought that was what was best, not just medically for the patient, but then to your guys' point, for the granddaughter in the corner and what she's experiencing as well. So this was certainly a sudden and a profound experience. And Aaron's right, I think, of speculating that this probably went into moral injury for a lot of these nurses. And then just kind of connecting the dots here, certainly I'm sure for some of these nurses led to some cynicism. I know they had some pushback for the ethics committee and not getting more heavy-handed, and that's part of the reason why we did make some changes later, but they got a little disengaged, I think, for at least some time after that. Okay, we're going to go on to the two paths. We're going to talk first about organizational path to avoid or alleviate burnout and moral distress. We're going to jump right into the very first step, and that is an opportunity to opt out. So actually, this case is a good scenario for that. If there's I don't think there was probably a single nurse who felt good about doing CPR, but you might have been able to identify a couple nurses who this is really going to be hard for them if they go through this situation. So is it an opportunity ahead of time for a nurse to come up and say, I've been caring for this patient off and on for 3 weeks. I've gotten to know the family. I'm very close. If I have to go in there and put my hands on this patient for CPR, it's going to be devastating for me. So is there the opportunity for her nurse leader to say, I get that, obviously, if you're the only one here to do it and we need you, we're going to have to ask you to do it. But if it's a time when we've got other people that can respond to that code, we're going to let you be the one that stands off in the corner with the family or stands outside the room so that you're not involved in that as much. Not always an option, of course, but sometimes I think it's more of an option than we realize. And for us as coworkers to raise our hand and say, I don't think I can do this. I think this hurts me too badly. And not just because it's stressful, but because it violates something deep inside of me, right? This is not something that I could feel good about. And so can we give those coworkers an opportunity to step aside and not do that if they're feeling that level of moral distress? So I think this is important to remind leaders and organizations, but it's also important for us to remind ourselves, right, that maybe we need to ask for that opportunity to step aside from that. If we can't opt out, can we take a timeout as a group, in this situation, after it's over, before it happens, if we can see this coming, you can't always see things coming, but if we can see it coming, that this is going to be hard on everybody, can we get everybody together and say, look, we realize that this patient codes that this is going to be super stressful for everybody. So let's talk about how we're going to process that, how we're going to handle it, how we can protect ourselves, sort of gauge everybody's level of moral distress ahead of time. Because sometimes it's unavoidable, right? You're going to experience that moral distress, but taking a minute to acknowledge that, and we're going to talk about leaders who listen here in just a second, and acknowledging the situation is a big deal. And that just flows right into our number 3. Really, if I had to winnow this list down from 7 to 1, this would be the 1: leaders who listen. Have you ever if you can find the chat again, put a yes in here. Have you ever had a situation where you're super stressed out and you sat down with your leader and you spilled it all, and she or he listened to you the whole way through, and you felt better afterwards, even if she or he didn't fix anything at all? Have you ever been in that situation? Hopefully you have. So say yes in the chat if you've had that situation, or maybe yes in the chat if you wish you would have had a leader who would have listened to all of those things as you got that off your chest. So the research really puts a primary link between does the nurse, does the coworker, does the doctor, the allied health professional, the non-clinical coworker, does that person feel supported? Do they feel like they have their leaders' support? Do they feel like they have the organization's support? That nothing reduces the effects of moral distress and burnout more than leaders who listen, an organization who is supportive. That there's a primary link between those two things. Organizational step number 4: well-being programs. Having some sort of system in place is going to help people, that gives resources, gives opportunities to support their coworkers. There's a neat study done actually in the central Indiana area for community health that linked a hospital or a physician well-being program. They instituted this well-being program for physicians, and then they found that their patients were having a better experience with the doctors because the doctors felt like they were being better taken care of. Now, there's a big warning here with well-being programs. If your institution is requiring long hours, don't have enough people to work on the floor, or in your department, just cutting pay, cutting resources, and somebody pops along with a gratitude journal, they're probably going to get whacked over the head with that gratitude journal. The well-being program is not going to fix moral distress. It's not going to fix burnout. Well-being programs are like a parachute. They're most noticed when they're missing or faulty. If I'm sitting here struggling with moral distress, injury, burnout, and there's nothing happening, like a well-being program, nobody's coming along and saying, hey, here's ways that you can reduce your stress, I'm going to notice as a coworker, and I'm going to be super frustrated. Aaron, I saw you doing a lot of nodding. Anything you'd add to this section about well-being programs?
Boy, this is a huge part of my work, actually. And this is one of the largest gaps in this area, is you know, organizations, well-being programs are like Band-Aids. Organizations implement well-being programs or EAP offerings for their staff, and then they kind of wash their hands of it, saying, well, we've provided this for you. But what the staff sees is something additional instead of it being helpful. And they're less likely to take advantage of whatever this well-being program is, because we've put a Band-Aid on something without reaching the root cause. And so it's really about a root cause, addressing a root cause, and then implementing a well-being program as a facilitator instead of a Band-Aid. So that's, I mean, that in a nutshell, boy, we could have a whole nother meeting about that. This is big. And a lot of people want to put the well-being program Band-Aid on something to be able to, on paper, say they did it. But the question is, who's benefiting from it? Not very many people. So that's, yeah.
Utilization rates often very, very low. And where the other pieces, like you said, where they haven't actually identified what is really needed, then the utilization rates go down even further, for sure. Yeah, thank you. All right, let's go on to organizational step number 5. We've got to have non-punitive ways for people to say that I'm just really not doing very well. So EAP is a good example of a way to do this, especially if coworkers believe it's confidential. EAP is always intended to be confidential in that employee assistance program, counseling, that sort of thing. But coworkers have to really believe that they're not going to get in trouble for asking for help. And so I would just suggest that one of the best ways a leader can do this is to say, is to visit EAP themselves and then say, when I talk to my counselor EAP, this is how it helps me. That doesn't mean the leader has to divulge all their secrets of what they're talking about with their counselor, but to make it normal, right? It's normal for people to seek these systems of support. And so we've got to really believe, though, that we're not going to get in trouble by saying, hey, I'm super depressed. I don't have the energy to come to work. I'm not sure I can keep doing this. That we have to believe that we can say that without getting in trouble. Very similarly, we've got to be able to say something's not going right with the actual job that I'm doing, this non-clinical program that I'm working on, or this patient experience that's happening for this patient right now. We got to be able to say things are not going right, because what do we want to do as coworkers? We want to do a great job. And when we feel like we're not doing a great job, we're not really providing the care that we want to provide, that moral distress creeps in and can get worse and worse. So we've got to have a system. I remember several years ago when a leader of ours introduced a new metric and a goal for our health system that he wanted to vastly increase the amount of error reporting that was happening. And I thought, isn't that backwards? Don't you want to not have a lot of error reporting? Because that means you don't have a lot of errors. And then I finally clicked for me. He wanted to make it normal, non-punitive. In fact, we were going to be in trouble if we didn't do a lot of error reporting. And so so that opportunity to report those things is really significant. Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
Well, yeah, so this is the other big part of my research, so I can't stay quiet for a second if you don't mind. Yeah, so Amy Edmondson is someone who does work around psychological safety in the workplace, and a huge, a big part, a component of that, of a psychologically safe environment, is the ability to use your voice. So the concept of voice is huge, and that can only be done when there is a feeling of safety in that workplace setting. And in my extensive research on all of this, rising to the top of the number one reason that people leave either their job or their profession in healthcare is because they are afraid. They are afraid of being punished. And so they make an exit strategy on their own. And we have a huge problem with turnover, which all of my nursing colleagues on this call will attest to. Our turnover is a profound phenomenon that is destroying our profession. And really it does come back to leadership and fostering a psychologically safe environment where you can use your voice to speak up. And what Amy Edmondson's work shows in healthcare actually is that the units who have the highest error reporting statistics are the healthiest units, because they have a voice. They feel safe to use their voice. And it's just, I mean, that right there, it's clear and it's simple. And yet we make it very complicated. And we drive out really good talent by doing that. So thank you for letting me talk.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. So kind of going along with the same theme, organizational step number 7, peer support, formal, informal, coworkers supporting coworkers. So not just the leaders, but also having a team around you, having those conversations saying, hey, that reaction, that's a normal expected reaction to what you're experiencing. And then those expressions of gratitude, like, hey, I'm still here. I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad you came back to work another day, these sorts of expressions. And I'm guessing that some of you have probably stayed at a job. Maybe you were not so keen on the pay anymore. Maybe you weren't so keen on the work or even the leader, but you stayed at that job because of the people that were there, your coworkers, people that you enjoyed being with, and that just kind of kept you going. So this can be formalized, but certainly it can be informal as well. So when we think about these, so that's the last of the steps for the organizational path. But I want to kind of recap a couple of things. One is systems. So if the electronic medical record is causing daily issues in patient care, that's going to lead to more moral distress, because that clinician feels like they can't really do what they want to do for their patients. If there's all sorts of bureaucracy, this is clinical or non-clinical, right? So if there's all sorts of bureaucracy, if you can't really do your work without a million pieces of red tape and everybody checking off, that's a system that is fostering moral distress. And then other systems alleviate that moral distress. So we talked about the support systems, peer-to-peer, formal or informal. But also, if we just make it a habit of every time we have a meeting, or if we have weekly meetings, maybe we do it once a month. If we have quarterly meetings, maybe we do it for 5 minutes every time, and talk about mental health stress, talk about moral distress, talk about burnout, then it normalizes those things, and we are able to talk about it. So you can systematize the way that we address this as well. And then just to highlight, I think the one that's most crucial again is leaders who listen, because it's not enough. We could say, hey, we've got the supportive system at our organization or in our department or on our team. It's not enough to have it. It is necessary for them to feel like it's supportive. And so listening is a way to make them feel supported. I don't know how many times I've been credited as a leader with genius and problem solving skills when I did nothing but and let the person talk it out until they find their own genius and their own solution to the problem. Okay, so my story, which is pretty personal and ongoing. I would love to cast this story as a past story, but it is definitely still a work in progress. So just in last fall, I was at this place. I probably could have said I was burned out, but I wouldn't have had the understanding of what are the traits of burnout and that sort of thing at that time. But I was definitely emotionally exhausted. One of our teams, our chaplaincy team, during the pandemic, which it's hard to say, like, when did the pandemic start? When did it end? Has it ended? The way that I mark the pandemic beginning and end for me, and I agree that there's other ways to look at it, is from March 13th, 2020. That's the day my kids got sent home from school. That's the day we started shutting things down at the hospital. That week, we'd seen an NBA game get canceled before it even got started. To October 13th, 2022. October 13th, 2022, our hospital system took away the mask mandate, and our numbers haven't really spiked again, COVID numbers since then. So during that 2.5 years, our chaplaincy team responded to 5,563 patient deaths. Now, obviously not all of those were COVID, but COVID inflated the numbers of patient deaths beyond what we'd ever experienced before. So in the midst of doing that, and then trying to help the health system with ethical leadership and writing policies really for the first time ever, and other things were going on, entered into some leadership conflict that was new at that point in time, and was just a byproduct of all the stress that was happening. Meetings for years on off hours. This is common experience for healthcare leaders during, well, really all the time, but certainly during the pandemic years. In an inflated way, really being pulled away from family life. I remember one moment that's really ingrained in my mind is having a kiddo playing a sport, playing rugby on a field, and standing about 250 yards away because I'm on a Teams call on a Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. about some crisis that's going on. And obviously, I wasn't the only one on the call. Lots of other people are on the call, lots of people experiencing it. But that disruption to some of my primary values for my family and myself, I just had to walk away from a lot of social media during that time. I took myself, especially off of Facebook, stopped doing anything with Twitter because of the distress it was causing me. So this is just a few of the things that had been happening leading up to the fall of 2022. Not to mention we had a father-in-law die, a good friend die, a grandmother die, an aunt die, friends and family who were going through some really hard times. So this is one picture from my 44th birthday, me and 3 of our 4 kiddos as we're going out to lunch that day at Casa Grande. But there was already something happening inside for me at that point, and I'd been paying attention to over the course of the day. And later ended up in the hospital on my birthday. It was Labor Day this past fall, with an experience for the first time of AFib. And I didn't really feel that badly, but I could feel the AFib. I know some people can and some people can't. I could definitely feel what was happening. And so my Apple Watch went off telling me, this is what's happening. I went in, told the doctor. I don't think they love it when you've already self-diagnosed with your wearable device. But he was like, all right, well, let's check it out. And sure enough, the watch was right. The EKG machine showed AFib as well. It's pretty regular and significant. And so the doctor said is, what we do for patients in the first onset of AFib in the first 24 hours is we administer cardioversion. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, it's when we shock people. It's like, oh, I know what that is. I didn't know that was the word for it. He's like, so we're going to shock you. And I thought he was joking. I was like, I thought he's messing with me. I'm a coworker, whatever. I was like, oh yeah, sure. He's like, no, it's not a joke. This is the recommended procedure. And then if your heart returns to rhythm, it might just stay that way. And you might not need a bunch of medication or follow up, that sort of thing. I was like, okay, all right, well, yeah, that let's do it. And he's like, so most of the time we sedate people for this, because you don't want to be awake when you get 255 joules through your chest, in this big patch here and out through your back. And I was like, well, do I have to be sedated? And he's like, well, I guess not. Like, you probably should be, but it's not necessary that you are. And I said, well, if I'm going to be electrocuted once in my life, I want to remember it, doggone it. I don't want to miss the opportunity to feel the experience. And so that increased the crowd in my room. One thing I've learned about emergency room coworkers is they like a good show. So all of a sudden, these people start filing into my room because the chairperson of the ethics committee and a department head is going to get shocked with 255 joules without being sedated. So that is exactly what happened. And some of you that are much more clinical than I am can read this pretty easily. The way that went up to the recommended shock there, and then that my heart very thankfully returned to a proper rhythm after that. So some medication, some follow-up, but certainly was an eye-opening experience. Very shortly after that, experienced another first. So first was AFib in September, and then in October I was diagnosed with depression for the first time in my life. And I know that I am grateful that at 44, this was the first time I'd had a real true mental health diagnosis. I'm grateful for that. So I recognize my privilege in that. But also we have to pay attention when something happens for the first time in our lives, right? And so this was significant for me. AFib had happened, then on the heels of it, depression. And then I talked with my counselor shortly thereafter, told her about the two things, diagnosed with depression and AFib. And I literally said to her, but I don't think the two are related at all. And she's very wise. She kind of cocked her head and said, really? And helped me to see how maybe my physical health, the deterioration of my physical health and my mental health were connected after all. And you have to remember in all this, white, middle-aged, educated Christian pastors, we're not super great at vulnerability and changing our sense of identity. This is not our strong suit. Our strong suit is pretending we're okay all the time. So my sense of identity, I'm an ordained pastor. I'm a capable leader. I'm the chairperson of the ethics committee for Parkview Health. I'm helpful. I'm strong. I'm not sort of needy and debilitated, needing to take time for myself. But the way I would summarize it, that I think a lot of people could probably summarize their experience too, is the work that I enjoyed for so long was killing me. And we see this on our coworkers' faces. We see this experience, whether we know what they're battling or we don't, we could see what's happening on their faces, that this is impacting them so significantly. So I started to do, since that time, some study on burnout and going through a personal recovery journey. That is not to say that I have personally recovered, but I am on that journey, and I want to share some of those things here in just a second. This may be the most important thing that you can hear, or that people that are experiencing burnout right now can hear. These experiences are not fair. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of situation. It's things that happen to good people who want to do a good job, that are put into impossible situations over and over. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of disability of any kind when a person is burned out. It means they came in wanting to do a good job, and they're good people, and they've been put into really difficult situations over and over again. So what if we don't? What if we don't address these things? We don't address moral distress and burnout. Qualitatively or quantitatively, the Surgeon General thinks we're going to be short a bunch of doctors, as many as 140,000 physicians in just under 10 years. That's really significant. Those nurses, there was 92% of nurses in the acute care setting said that the pandemic stresses would shorten their careers. Well, guess what? Over time, those nurses are going to start to disappear if we don't address moral distress and burnout. Again, quantitatively, there's going to be a lack of access to healthcare for our citizens. It's already hard to find a doctor. It's already hard sometimes to get into a hospital. Hospitals at capacity in a lot of places a lot of the time. So that is not going to get better if we don't address moral distress and burnout. It's going to get worse. And then, of course, qualitatively, disengaged coworkers. Your mom, your grandma, your sister, your spouse, your daughter is going to be taken care of by nurses who are burned out and just not as engaged as they once were. And again, that's not their fault. It's their experience of being put into impossible situations over and over. That empathy is drying up, has dried up in a lot of cases. We're going to have higher costs because we're going to be making mistakes, and we're not going to feel that psychological safety to report those things. And so we're going to have those high costs due to errors. A lot of coworkers already, of course, experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and then absenteeism. If you're in this state, it's hard to go to work, right? If you've been in the state before, it's hard to get up in the morning and go to work, or to get up at night and go to work, depending on when your shift is. And then, of course, the scariest part, we already know that physician suicide is really, really rampant and really scary. But the current situation is not helping us in that regard. So I really feel like this is kind of what's been missing from a lot of what I've looked through so far, is like, how do you as an individual sort of recover? So I'm going to share a few of the things that I've been doing. I think really a prerequisite before you can get on the path is understanding what these things are. What is moral distress? Is the definitions that we've talked about. What is moral injury, and what are the characteristics of burnout? So thinking through those things, identifying those things. Do I feel emotionally exhausted? Do I feel cynical, like everything's just, dark and gray and cloudy and is never going to change? Do I feel like I'm not able to do the work I want to do when I go to work? So I think before we can start to recover, we have to identify, right? We have to identify that we're experiencing moral distress, moral injury, or burnout. And then here's 7 options. So these aren't prescriptive. These are descriptive, some descriptions of things that have been helping me. First and foremost, I would say this is adjusting the expectations you have of yourself. I think a lot of people have gotten into healthcare because they want to make a difference. They want to change the world. Well, that's a pretty heavy weight to carry, right? To try to make a big difference in an individual's life, let alone in a family, in a unit, in a community, in the world. Sometimes we have to say, if I was a reasonable person other than myself, who is looking at the sort of expectations I'm putting on myself right now, would that really be fair? Would a reasonable person actually expect of me what I am expecting of me? Or do I need to adjust those expectations? See, we sort of pile these things up. I've done this for so long, and then I added this, and then I added this, and then I added this, and then I added this. And then I went through all these difficult things, but I should be able to continue spinning all the plates I've always spun. And that's just not logical. It's not fair. It's not reasonable. And similarly, so the adjusting expectations is sort of a task. Like, should I still be expected to do all of this long list of to-dos? And then decrease your focus and your intensity is internal, right? Not the task list, but how you're going about it on the inside. Is it okay to in some respects go through the motions while still caring deeply inside of you? But is it okay to sometimes not be so intent, to not raise your hand for every extra thing, to not be so thinking about work and thinking about the job you're trying to do all the time? Is it okay to decrease your focus and your intensity? Third of all, and this is a new topic for me that I'm still beginning to understand, and that's your somatic nervous system, your fight, your flight, your freeze response, how your body responds with dopamine and serotonin. And I'm talking about things I don't fully understand, but I've been practicing. And so I found an online content creator, watched all our videos, trying to understand how my nervous system has been affected by what I've been through the past few years, and exercises and practices that I can do to try to recover. This is my favorite one. Probably not the most important one, but my favorite one is option number 4, to make a bucket list. And I know that may sound crazy. If I'm burned out, I'm stressed out, this is not a good time to make a bucket list. But what making a bucket list and working on it does is, one, it takes your focus away from work. It takes your focus away from the stress, and it affirms that you're a person who has desires other than just surviving day to day at work. You have desire, you have places you want to go and different things you want to do. And so, yeah, so Ben Nempton, Kristen's dropped the website for Ben in here. He's come and spoke to a couple events, and I am a huge fan of his. He and I have actually corresponded, met in person a couple of times, and he is from the old MTV show, The Buried Life. If you ever remember watching The Buried Life on MTV, I wasn't allowed to watch MTV because I was raised too conservative, so I never got to see it. But I need to go back and watch it now. He's just got some fantastic thoughts about what do you want to do before you die, and his main admonition is people regret things they didn't do much more than they regret things they did. And so what this has done for me is to say, I don't have to just be stressed out about work all the time. I could say, you know what, I would really like to have TSA pre-check, so when I fly I can go through that short little line. I could put that on a bucket list and I could check it off, and then I can go to Florida, and when my kids are flying with me, they have to wait in a long line, and I'm just zipping through the pre-check. We'll see you guys on the other side in an hour or so. That was a bucket list thing for me, and you know what? It felt awesome. It felt great to do that, and it affirmed my desire, and it sort of does away or is an antidote to some of that cynicism that I was experiencing. Personal path option 5, draw boundaries. Find those energy suckers. What's really draining you? What do you dread going to do? What do you feel drained about afterwards? Is there a way that you can minimize those or eliminate those altogether? You might need to step away for a while, take a leave of absence, take a week off, and to recalibrate for sure. Option number 6, develop some mantras. I've never really been much of a mantra guy until recently, and these first 2 have really helped me. And then I'm going to include one that Kristen likes as well. Things can change at any time. This is true, right? It is true. Mantras don't work if they're lies. It is true that things can change at any time. So when I feel trapped or hopeless, that sort of thing, I can remind myself that things can change at any time. Or if you want to sound more philosophical, this too shall pass. Things are going to change. And then Kristen likes this one. I've survived 100% of my bad days. Last but not least, option number 7, confide in 1 or 2 trusted people. Don't make the mistake of confiding in 1 or 200 people and telling them all about how upset you are, how much this sucks, and I can't believe this is what's going on, because that's just going to feed your cynicism. But finding a couple people that you can really confide in is really special. So final step is self-forgiveness. If we experience moral distress, it means we feel badly about something we did or we watched happen. And we need to come to a place where we can have compassion on ourselves and where we can forgive ourselves for having done that or having to be a part of whatever that was. So self-forgiveness does 2 things. First of all, it affirms my values. So when I say, I forgive myself for recommending a 0 visitor policy at the beginning of the pandemic, it affirms my value. What's my value? My value is that families and friends should be kept together at these really difficult moments. That's my value. And so when I say I forgive myself, it actually affirms that value because I do need to forgive myself for that. And so it affirms my values. But second of all, it also affirms my value. I'm worthwhile. I still have value as a human being. And so self-forgiveness affirms my values, but also says, I still have value and I have value to offer going forward at work and in the world. Excuse me. Okay, I've been talking quick. I'm going to put this up on the screen. Kristen's going to drop a link in the chat too. Love for you to take just a minute right now before we end with a word of encouragement after all this difficult topic. You can click on the link that Kristen's dropped in there or scan the QR code, whichever one's more convenient for you. It's going to take you to the same place. It'll take you 2 minutes, maybe less than 2 minutes to do that. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee, take a breath before we end with a word of encouragement here. And we'll get out right about on time. I hope that's a new Bronco, Aaron, and not like one of the early 90s Broncos.
Yeah, no, it's not the OJ Bronco. It's new, but it's a heritage edition throwback to 1966. So yeah, I love it.
Very cool.
But it was definitely aligns with what you're talking about with the that feeling of walking through the TSA line. Like, I'm like, you know what? I can do this. Why am I not doing it? And it has really been an odd, I mean, talk about first world problems, right? But, I work hard. So I'm like, this is a thing that is mine. So it's been very validating for me.
We had a chaplain. So when we do annual check-ins, sometimes I ask our coworkers to complete the sentence, someday I want to, and then fill in the blank, to complete that sentence 3 times. And one of my favorite examples of that is we had a chaplain, not an older guy, but 10, 15 years older than us. And he's a Baptist minister. I mean, very conservative, traditional sort of pastoral guy, just a good guy. He said, someday I want to have a Ford Mustang. And he's like, I know that's silly and that's selfish. I was like, why is that silly and selfish? You've been ministering to people for 40 years. If you want to have a Ford Mustang, there's nothing wrong with that. And a couple of years later, we had our retreat and Mark drove up in his bright red Ford Mustang. I was like, that's awesome.
That's amazing.
And we could be so happy about that for other people. But you're right. Sometimes when it comes to ourselves, it's like, I don't know. Do I deserve that? Is that okay? And going through those hoops.
Yeah.
Well, just a word of encouragement at the end here. There's we've talked about the impacts that moral distress and burnout can have, but it can't actually dim your dignity. It can't change anything about who you are. Can't demote your value. Can't wash away how much you're worth. And you have a unique contribution to make at work. Even more importantly, you have a unique contribution to make in your family and your circle of friends and the people that you run with. All these heavy, difficult experiences can't change actually how much you're valuable. It can change how much you feel like you're valuable, how much you might feel like you're worth less than you were before. But the fact of your meaning and significance in the world and your dignity and your value, your worth are immutable. They are unchangeable. And so even though we go through these difficult things, to remind ourselves that there's nothing that can actually change that. We wouldn't think that about anybody else. We wouldn't look at any other coworker or any other friend or family member and say, well, you've been through a whole lot of stuff, and so all of a sudden you're not really worth very much. We certainly would never say that about another person. So why would we think that about ourselves? We can't rationalize our way out of it. And, we can only sort of forgive our way out of this. So these two paths, organizational, personal. So I should have mentioned, if you did the review, you'll get a lot of this on a PDF here in the next few days as well, that you can review some of these things. But that is all I've got for today. Kept you about a minute over, but thank you guys. Thank you for participating, chiming in. Any other final thoughts, questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and make a couple comments before we go.
I will say one thing. Sorry, I wasn't going to say anything, but I want to plug a book. I didn't write it. I've got no connection, except that from the healthcare standpoint, Cinda Rushton. I don't know if you know who Cinda Rushton is. She's an incredible trailblazer in this space. She's a nurse, and she wrote this book called Moral Resilience, Transforming Moral Suffering in Healthcare. Highly, highly, highly recommend. I have met her in person. I've heard her speak, and she's just a really incredible human who's doing really great work in this area. So, and she's got some really good tangible ideas and tips and studies that she's done that are included in this book and other work that she's done. So just plug that for her.
Very cool. Thank you.